I have a lot of fear of the experts and of people who take on the title expert, sort of intentionally, knowingly. So that's another kind of takeaway is to, don't be so trusting. You have to ask where other people got their beliefs from before you trust them.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a special guest today, Oliver Traldi. You are an author. You do a lot of stuff, actually, and write some things that, I got to be honest, I find some level of humor in your writing as well because it's very pointed. It sounds like a New Yorker wrote it, if I may be so bold.
Yeah. My parents grew up in New York. I live in New Jersey now, but yeah, that's right.
So for the audience, tell us about yourself. You're promoting a book as well. Tell us about the book and tell us about yourself and your background a little bit.
Yeah. So my name's Oliver. Right now, I'm a postdoc here at Princeton. I wrote a book called Political Beliefs. It's about what it sounds like. It's about people's political beliefs, especially the way politics works in America right now, the way formations of political beliefs work in America right now. For the past 5 years before coming here to New Jersey, I was in Indiana. I was doing a PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and that's sort of where I started doing public writing and magazine writing. Just a lot of writing about politics and culture and campus politics, academic politics, sort of social justice politics, what's been come to be known as wokeness. And politics of censorship, free speech, stuff like that.
What do you, if you had to define wokeness, what would you say it is exactly? Because I think a lot of people have different. There's a variety of definitions for this stuff, and then some people use it as a catch-all for anything they don't like.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. I actually organized a sort of reading group or seminar this spring on wokeness here at Princeton, and we didn't actually do. I felt that we didn't do a great job of coming up with a definition. It has something to do with, a woke person will tend to see events or things in terms of who's oppressed by them, who's disadvantaged. They'll sort of want to view things in terms of what they see as power. But that doesn't explain all parts of wokeness. That's not all that wokeness is about. Wokeness, part of it is that there are sort of groups that are sort of, from the outset taken to be disadvantaged. So, for example, in the debate between trans advocates and radical feminists who are anti-trans, it's woke to be pro-trans, even though both sides claim that they're oppressed. So I never really found a satisfying definition. I think it's one of those things where people sort of wave their hands and say, you know it when you see it. Honestly, I mean, what's woke is changing all the time as well, which to me is one of the weirdest things about it. That you can be woke this year and then next year you'll be conservative.
Yeah, it's so it's an oppression and power hierarchy. So I guess the follow-up question would be who gets to define the hierarchy? It just seems kind of like a free market for stupidity, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the objection, even to that definition, that it really is a matter of, it's a matter of who wins in this what you call it, the free market of stupidity, right? Like sort of who has the louder voice. Or who has the claim that is promoted within woke circles to having been oppressed or to being oppressed. You have these sort of, and this is something, these ideas are things that precede wokeness. These are debates that, leftists have had for decades, but this idea of the oppression Olympics, where, somebody says, well, here are my intersectional credentials. I'm, a disabled woman. Well, here on the other side, I'm a poor black man. So who's in what part of the power hierarchy? And I think a lot of this sort of, unsophisticated woke discourse involves things like that, just saying, well, who gets to win out in sort of the question of who has more power. with of course having less power, meaning you win out, which is already an interesting, you know, notion of power. Um, I do think there are sophisticated woke people who are much more concerned about, things like material conditions, and poverty, and things like that. But once you really get invested in material conditions, and how people actually live and what people's actually concerns are, then you move much closer to more traditional forms of politics, like, social democracy, or sort of, standard capital D democratic politics in the United States, and away from wokeness.
It kind of seems like there might be an opportunity for some good or bad actor to take advantage of whatever mechanism is deciding what woke point to focus on at any given time.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and I think sometimes when you see, I don't want to say much about what's happening on college campuses right now, because I don't have like a great understanding of geopolitics or what's going on in the Middle East. And obviously, whenever a lot of people are dying in a war, there's reason to be upset about it. But I do think that there are these questions about how quickly attention can shift from one issue to another. I often talk about the example of, I feel like in the early days of wokeness, campus politics was really oriented around campus sexual assault, and these sort of tribunals for college students who were accused of sexual assault, and what levels of evidence you needed to convict somebody, and whether they were kicked off campus and things like that. And very quickly, and there were also feminist issues like the wage gap and stuff, that were really important. And very quickly, the gender issues and wokeness moves to uh, pro and anti-trans debates. And a lot of the sort of classic feminist issues went by the wayside. So I think, these things are always shifting, and probably somebody who's really savvy could manipulate them to their own advantage. But I do think there's a large woke discourse. So the way these things shift is probably partly, it's no one person who controls it. It's actually really, to me, it's really difficult to figure out how one issue comes up and another one becomes less important. With the exception of, obviously, when there are instances of police violence or alleged police violence, that always brings the race issue back. And when that happens, that's always the number one issue. But other than that, it seems to me to be always shifting. What's the primary concern, and sort of where the hierarchies
Sure,
land.
yeah. It seems like, oh, so when I hear the same talking point parroted across multiple uh, uh, media channels, I get really suspicious of that. It's like, who's is this just garden variety laziness and incompetence, or is there something more going on there? And I'm sure you've seen these videos, compilation videos on the internet of local news stations across the country all having the same statement on this issue or that issue, and it's like, okay, one of the things you talk about in the book is information bubbles and how people get stuck in an ecosphere that
Yeah.
is completely absent of any kind of alternate thought or dissent or anything like that, and it just crushes any kind of skepticism that people might have. They just kind of, you get used to hearing the same stuff all the time. You're like, oh, well, that must be
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think that, if people are using the exact same phrase, I do think, yeah, then I would be on the same page. I would start to wonder, maybe somebody came up with this phrase and disseminated, their little talking points around, Um, but in general, I think a lot of these things can happen organically, just based on who people's social circles are, what people's media sources are, um, and through credentialism. And this is something we see in the university, sort of writ large, that the more, part of achieving a credential can involve taking on views that are of one political orientation or another, right? Um, and that can be within the discipline, so, an economist it might be required in a sense that an economist have different political views than a sociologist. Um, but then also, explicitly in the institution through things like DEI statements, um, and also through the social politics of who gets hired and who gets promoted. Um, so I think that there's a lot of ways that these bubbles can form, and that the bubbles can seem like they can seem virtuous to people. They can seem like, well, we're just listening to the experts. We're just listening to the good people. Those people outside the bubble, they need to educate themselves. You used to hear this a lot. It's not my job to educate you. Um, and so, yeah, these bubbles, I think they form very organically. Um, and it can be very hard to tell when you're in one. There are a lot of views that I'm open to, that I think other people on both sides of the aisle that I think other people wouldn't. And I can sometimes forget, this is like not a normal view. So even though I'm not one, I took a class on Marxism this semester, or I sat in on it, and I'll just throw around, this is the Marxist view in conversation, and people will look at me like I'm crazy. So I think it's very easy to start thinking that something is normal or the consensus or accepted or something. And it's hard to remember. We live in a really big country, with a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of viewpoints. Um, and due to geography, media, profession, um, socialization, very, very easy to end up in a bubble, with complete accident.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I mean, maybe that's just a function of uh, an oversaturation of ideas. Like it's 200 years ago, people didn't need to have that many political opinions, right? They cared about
Yeah.
taxes and freedom and defense, and that was pretty much it, right? I mean, the government wasn't, I guess, large enough to interfere with their lives enough where they really had to care about any of this stuff. And I don't think intellectually speaking, we've caught up yet. I don't think people have developed either the Constitution to ignore shit that doesn't matter to them, or the capability, or even having the time in their daily life to really have thought out, like, viewpoints on these issues. Like, people have hard opinions on things that they have very little understanding of, which is kind of bizarre to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. It's something that has surprised me too. And the fact that, I think one thing that makes me different from some of the people who are around me in the academy is I love to have the opportunity to say, well, I don't know much about that, so I don't have to have an opinion about it. There's nothing more. It's so relaxing, actually, to feel that you don't have to have an opinion. Um, but a lot of people love having opinions. And if you try not to on some issue, they'll say, well, why haven't it's your responsibility it's your responsibility to be aware of what's going on in the world, to be aware of what's going on around you. Um, but then you think about, how much is going on in the world, how many wars are going on in the world right now, how many, alleged crises of different types, even just understanding, say, climate change or artificial intelligence. Um, to truly understand that, you would need to spend all of your time just on that one topic, right? Um, and so I think what people do is there are two things people do. One is they develop these heuristics where it's sort of like, I can, I can judge this issue just off the top of my head, just, without really diving into it, just by looking at how, something about how things are relating to each other. Um, and so a lot of the heuristics are like wokeness in a way that we were talking about before is a kind of heuristic, right? Like, look for who has power and then be on the other side. That's just like a kind of heuristic about how to judge complex political situations. Another one is like follow the money. Another one would be like, don't trust centralized government. And so there are all these heuristics that people use to make sense of these complex issues. Um, but that's a way to make sense of them without diving into the details. Um, because there's too many details. The world is too detailed. Um, and the other one is sort of this formation of where am I getting my information? Experts and trusted sources, and things like that. Uh, and this is part of, I think both of these concern me, but I think the second one concerns me even more because really in the U.S. for the past few decades, what we've seen is the information sources just becoming themselves politicized, so that the information sources just are the bubbles, right?
Mm.
Um, and so people don't have the energy to really learn about things in detail, and so they trust these sources. Uh, and then people have these epiphany moments when they realize, oh, my source got it completely wrong on this. I can't trust the experts on that. I can't trust the media on this. I can't trust this or that political party, right? And then they get thrown into this position of not knowing who to trust, and turns out not knowing who to trust means not knowing what to believe. Um, so those are what I would say are sort of the two strategies people generally have: heuristics and sources.
Mm.
But neither of them are super reliable when it comes to the details.
Sure, yeah. And then for someone like you that is comfortable not having an opinion on something, it seems like there's a lot of pressure externally to have an opinion on everything. So if you don't have, let's say you don't have a specific opinion on the Israel Hamas war,
Yeah,
people might say, "What do you don't care about this group or that group, or you don't care about human life or whatever." It's like, no, I just
yeah,
like what why should it's not that I don't care that violence is happening, people are dying, people are suffering. It's like, well, one, there's nothing I can do about it.
mhm,
And two, what the fuck does that have to do with me exactly?
yeah,
Like you can't. I'll ask people this kind of incredulously, but I'll ask them like, well, I mean, somebody died in your country today, a bunch of people, as a matter of fact. What did you have any particular feeling about that, or is it because it's not in the news, you just don't give a shit about that? So maybe you don't care about human life. What you didn't go out of your way to go. I mean, it's just a kind of a preposterous thing to
yeah.
assume that everybody should care about everything all the time.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking about this just a couple weeks ago about the patterns of when people think something is worth caring about, when people think something is worth learning about. I think probably it has something to do with, yeah, like you said, what can I do about that? So I think people often, if they've decided to care about something, they will sort of backfill into it some sort of plan of action. So with the protests right now, for instance, they have this idea that they're going to get colleges to divest from companies that do business from Israel. And my understanding first is that colleges are not going to do this, but also that even if colleges were to do this, that it wouldn't really make a dent, you know? So they have a kind of plan of action, but the plan of action does not necessarily, it sort of peters out, and is not like a full theory. Leftists have this phrase, theory of change. So theory of change means how are you actually going to accomplish something? Um, and I think a lot of people who are involved in politics at the activist, at the like unpaid activist level, at the sort of hobbyist level, they don't have this theory of change. They don't have a sense of um, how are my actions actually going to, uh, concretely affect the political situation. Um, Now, probably some do. I don't mean to paint with a broad brush activists on either side of the aisle. But I do think that there's a question of, without a sense of how you're actually going to affect things, what do people get out of it? And I think part of the answer is that, you know, in American politics, well, in American life more generally, people get a sense of like identity and meaning and social belonging out of their political commitments. Especially with uh, in my program here, I'm around a lot of Catholics that, we talk a lot about declining religiosity, and increasing secularism. And I think, uh, as those kinds of belief systems become less popular, people need other belief systems that can provide sort of cognitive structure and moral structure for their lives. So wokeness in particular is something that just sort of says, here's what's good and bad in the world, and here's how to save your soul, right? Do these DEI trainings, and you'll save your soul. Um, and that's something that was missing. So I think, yeah, when you see people don't have a clear plan of action, you want to say, well, you know, if they're not trying to actually accomplish something concrete, what are they trying to do, sort of psychologically? And I think a lot of the times it's something like that, something having to do with meaning and purpose in life.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like these folks, even the ones who are, I guess, rooted to some degree in the theory of change ideology, also seem to frequently, if not most of the time, settle for the lowest possible impact they can make. So then they can declare victory and move on to the next issue or something like that. Because it is an industry, just like every
Yeah.
other. And I wonder about, to your other point, you talk about heuristics and sources, and then we have. I don't think the theology of the religion is the big part of it. I think it is the I think it's the fact that there is a group ideology that people circle around, right? It's base, it's that common point where everybody you know that filters through all the information, I guess you could say. So people can there it creates some kind of standard because now it's just been backfilled more or less with cultural Marxism at this point, right? So I don't know if I don't think bringing back religion is a feasible solution at all because people just a lot of people are just done with that
No.
stuff. So and they're not interested in for whatever reason. I mean, it's I think the Jews have handled this really well over the years because I know a lot of American and Israeli Jews and half of them are religious, half of them not. But culturally speaking, they are all
Mhm.
Jews, right?
Yeah.
And that community hasn't been afforded to or created by or afforded to other Westerners like Christians, right? There's just like where is the I guess reservoir for a shared epistemology among Europeans and others here in America who were Christian and aren't anymore, or who don't take it seriously anymore. Like where do they? Where's the well for them to go to? Where's the water, the national water cooler or whatever? Where they're all like, yeah, I think this, I think this. Here are all the facts we agree on, and here's the debate based on those facts. That's not even a thing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people, yeah, so certainly, being Jewish myself, the secular Jews still participate in
Mm,
like me. I'm very secular. I never had a bar mitzvah or anything. But we still participate in the rituals. We still think of ourselves as sort of part of you know, Judaism is odd because it's sort of ethnicity and religion and culture, and it's like a little bit of each of them, and so you can have, you can lose parts of it and still be participating in it in some way. Um, I think, one of the things people say about wokeness is that, in a sense, wokeness is, it does have elements of Christianity in it. It has some sense of original sin, and it has some sense of redemption, and it has rituals. Um, and so that to me is sort of the closest to the modern, like contemporary evolution of Christian notions. Of course, that's coming from outside the Christian tradition. Um, Here at, being at Notre Dame and then here at the James Madison program, there's a strong Catholic community, obviously at Notre Dame and also here. And I do think that the Catholics Catholics maintain a pretty strong community and a pretty strong tradition, but of course, Catholics themselves are a religious minority in the U.S. and always have been. And I do think that sometimes, you know, the feeling of being a minority group can sort of, it can harden. You can have this motivation to form a hardcore around a set of beliefs or motivations, um, and I think, so for example, I think that's happened with conservatives in academia. I'm friends with a lot, and to some degree, I'm one myself. Because we also have this feeling of where, within academia, we're against this large majority of progressives and liberals. And so we need to sort of, uh, gather in a sense. I don't know if that makes much sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think also that a big part of the absence of traditions is the absence of rites of passage into adulthood or positions of responsibility, particularly for young men, right? Another thing that the Jewish community has done really well, even in the secular side, is maintaining there's a bar mitzvah, right?
Yeah, yeah,
There's like a concrete passage from child to adult, which may seem I don't know. It may seem pointless to some folk, but I think it's a really important thing because every culture in the history of human beings has had one until relatively recently. I mean,
yeah,
the Romans would throw the kid out into the woods and make him kill people or whatever. If it was the Greeks rather, not the Romans. But everybody's kind of had their own version of this to some degree throughout history. The Confirmation and Catholicism still does it, but that's a religious organization, right? That didn't leak over
yeah,
into the broader secular, European Christian
yeah,
ancestry. So I don't,
yeah,
that seems like a big problem to me, right? It's like, at what point does Dad hand little Junior the keys to the car, right? And now we
yeah,
see, you can see the practical fallout of this. We have men, particularly who are still living at home.
yeah,
25 to 30-year-olds are
yeah.
still living at home now.
That was me for a year.
It's
Yeah,
yeah, it's like, all
yeah.
right, well, how do we combat that?
Well, I think, up to a point, there were the issues of masculinity in America and young men, young disaffected men, jobless men, men who want to be jobless. That's a whole. In Japan, I think they call them the hikikomoris. I forget what the translation of that is. Um, but certainly, I think for a time there would be, rites of passage would just emerge naturally from life, right? You would just you would have your first job, and you would get married, and you would have a child, and this was just very normal for this to be on a certain kind of schedule, right? One thing that, I graduated from college in 2008 into the financial crisis. And I don't know if these differences had already begun before this, but certainly for people of my age, a lot of the normal things didn't happen on a schedule. Um, and people were getting settled into careers and into lives, and starting to have kids at a much later age. I saw a thread on Twitter about this yesterday about, I don't know if I agree with this or not, but it was somebody talking about, if you're getting married for the first time in your 40s, you shouldn't have a huge wedding because a big wedding is sort of, like you said, one of these coming of age rituals, one of these rites of passage. Um, and if you're that age, then you should think of yourself as already having come of age.
Mm,
You shouldn't be putting on the show like that. And I think this is something that, even 20 years ago when I was in college, there was a lot of talk about, people had these ideas of like a national service year. People
mm.
doing, after college, doing community service for a year, public service. Um, that of course never, nothing like that ever happened. Um, Lots of countries have mandatory military service. Israel, South Korea. I don't know exactly how many, but it's not so uncommon. Um, and I do think you're completely right that these things can happen where, um, into a sort of, young adult phase where they don't know what to do, and they're not hitting the benchmarks. And to a degree, people aren't telling them that there are benchmarks. People, you know, a lot of I think what people get told in life now is, don't rush. You have all the time in the world, um, which is certainly what I thought for a while. And then, my metabolism slowed down and I started losing my hair. Uh, And then I realized that there's not that much time in a human life. Um, so yeah, I do think that it can be tough, and it can be tough, uh, in a liberal society where we do want to accept all sorts of belief systems, right? And we want to have free speech and free belief. It can be tough to then say, well, we're going to set up the this way of living that gives people rites of passage and gives people ways of moving from one happy phase of their life to another happy phase of their life rather than getting lost and getting stuck. Um, and So I think it's the genuine, in a way, it's like the big question of our culture. And I think with the sorts of cultural challenges that we have right now, I think it'll just become more pressing, as, you know, certainly with the AI boom, uh, it's not looking like there are going to be more jobs available in the near future. If anything, there's going to be more automation and more questions about just what does a productive life even look like in the U.S.
Yeah. Creative destruction has become quite a bit more rapid than it's ever been. I mean, it's certainly sped up during the Industrial Revolution because there was the initial press, and then all the I guess tributaries of that, all the other like it kind of there it ebbed and flowed for a very long time. A lot of jobs went away in the beginning, and then a lot more were created, right, to deal with all the issues, the fallout from that stuff. But I agree with you now. It seems like automation is going to be the name of the game. So you think of someone in the 16th century. It's like I'm going to be born. I'm going to learn a trade from my dad, and that's what I'm going to do, right? So I don't have to worry about that shit. Like my life is pretty much planned out. I'm going to try to find a wife, and maybe if I'm so inclined, I try to gain some sort of upward mobility, whether it's a career change or patronage from someone or something like that. Right now, it's like that. Everybody's almost tabula rasa. Like you come out of the womb and it's like, all right, we'll see what happens in 18 years, right? And then
Yeah,
but hope's not a game plan. We just, I feel bad for kids coming up these days because it wasn't exactly, it wasn't exactly easy for my generation because, of all the disparity and such. And now it's like, it's absolute nonsense. Like who knows? Like I wouldn't even know, uh, if I had, let's say I had a child in high school, like what do you tell them about
yeah,
choosing a career? Because some stuff requires a certain type of degree, some stuff doesn't, some stuff requires a trade degree of some sort. It's like, all right, well, you're 18 and completely unprepared for life, so now make a decision on what you're going to do for the rest of it. You know what I mean? That
yeah.
that seems it seems like we may need to massage that a little bit and figure out a better strategy for the future.
Yeah, and I think obviously, I mean, obviously, there's tons of ways in which things are better now than in the 16th century, but I I do think that this sense of, you know, being a little purposeless and being a little lost is something that um, everybody's struggling with a bit these days. And yeah, hard to know what you would say to a teenager about what the world's going to look like when they graduate from college. You say at the beginning of the college, here's what you should do. 4 years later, that's completely, might be completely obliterated. And then there's while I was in grad school, I was teaching kids whose college experience was completely upended by COVID. And now, college graduation is being upended by these protests. So yeah, I think it's a time of um, a certain amount of instability. I grew up in the 1990s when it just seemed like we were just going to get better and better video games every year, and more and more money. The economy was just going to get better and better. Um, and Yeah, that was a really good time to grow up. And I think now is probably a much more confusing time. That's the sense that I have.
Sure, yeah, and maybe again, this is we're talking about multiple institutions that affect this stuff. I think the American education system has been pretty rough for some time now. I mean, if you track it back to its origins, it's industrialists in the early part of the 20th century who wanted to make factory workers, right? people that are smart enough to run the machines, but not so creative that they're, you know, building competition or leaving to go somewhere else. And it's gone fully into that now. I mean, if you think about if I were to say define a good student for me to the average person, the bullet points are going to look a lot like compliance, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's quiet, pays attention, does his work, so on and so forth. Certainly, there's a grading element at some point that would test the knowledge base, but the bulk of it is just sitting still. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And doing the work you're supposed to do. And that seems like a horrible idea. Especially so we still have this antiseptic education style that is meant to produce drones, but we have a a work environment now that requires people to be independent and creative. Otherwise, you're not going to succeed, right? So, look, I'm not an educator, so I have no idea how to handle this situation, but it's pretty clear what's going on. Kids are getting taught to live in a world that doesn't exist anymore, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was already, you know, one common type of complaint that in my mind unites. I don't think I've ever written about this. I've often tried to think what I would write about this, but one thing that to me united the feelings people had after the 2008 crash and the feelings people have about wokeness is that it's a lot of people saying things like, I did everything I was told to do, and now, you know, now I don't get a job, or now I get called a bad person, right? So you go to school and you're told to pay attention and learn. Here's what you do to get a job. Here's what you do to be a good person, and then suddenly it all changes, right? And people are just left saying, "Well, I was, to use your word, right? Like I was compliant, I was obedient, and yet the things that were promised to me were taken away from me." And I think it's a difficult realization that, often that is the way the world is. That you're taught by people, or the sort of what some institution tells you you'll be rewarded for, you don't actually get rewarded for. Um, I mean, certainly in academia and grad school, your professor is going to say, well, read these things, do these readings and just read them really carefully. You're here to learn, you're here to master some material. And it turns out, you have to sort of set out on your own path in the current academic job market because there's so few jobs in academia right now. You sort of have to, like you said, be creative and be agile, and be flexible sort of from day one. Um, and yeah, so I think this feeling of, I did everything I was supposed to do, and yet here's what happened.
Mm.
It's hard to know what to say about that feeling, but it's just, it's a special type of feeling of being betrayed by institutions or by a system, that I think a lot of people have these days.
Yeah, and the weird part to me, and I want to bring this back to beliefs in a minute, but the very bizarre part to me is that the vast majority, I would say, of people have been disenfranchised by that, right? At least in Gen Z, they you can see them coming through college now, and they're like, no, I'm not going to participate in this bullshit, in your bullshit anymore. But they
Mhm.
still tend to gravitate towards leftism, which empowers the state to have control over them, right? That is a weird ass. Like that doesn't make sense to me, but as I said, I want to go back to beliefs. If you're on the left, you probably think people are on the right are crazy, and then vice versa is probably true as well.
Yeah.
But that's very rarely ever true. If the bulk of our citizenry was crazy, we would fucking know about it. You know what I mean? It's just not true
Yeah.
that that's the case. So, I think what you do insofar as unpacking what the damage to our epistemology and not just the epistemology, but the variety of engines that create it is pretty important. But I think people need to take the time to stop and think about this stuff, right? In the data processing world, we call it GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Like,
Yeah.
are you? And this is I make this analogy sometimes, but it's the reason that your math teacher in school asked you to show your work. It wasn't to add extra work just to be a dick. It's like, okay, I can go back and look at your process and see where you messed up, and
Yeah.
then I
Yeah.
can correct that. But we don't have that anymore. It's a very trust me, bro situation, or whatever, and but it's if you're on one side or the other, I think it's really important to remember that the other guy is not crazy. Almost always,
Yeah.
that's not the case. But they do say things that to me sound fucking crazy. Like
Yeah.
these people that protest. Well, I guess it's taken a bit of a turn now for the far left, where they hate the government again. But for a very long time, people had resist in their Twitter bio, and then also Biden Harris 24. I'm like, all right, man. Like you can't hold the same beliefs as the entire institution and then
Yeah.
say you're resisting oppression. That's not how this works. Because so
Yeah.
that seems crazy to me. But I would love to understand how somebody went from a reasonable person into that, because that's not it's objectively that's not a reasonable belief to think that the government
Yeah.
that oppressed you is going to now save you. That's nonsense.
Yeah. Well, certainly one of the, and I don't think this comes in the book at all, but one thing in just my observations of American politics, one thing I've noticed is that nobody, and this is probably true elsewhere than America as well, nobody ever feels as though they have power. Um, that's part of why the term power I find a little slippery sometimes. Um, and one of the things that brought this home, this is one of the early times I started even thinking about this stuff. This is probably, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago. It was just this small quote from an Obama administration official in the New York Times or the Washington Post or something, um, where this Obama administration official said, we think of our job as speaking truth to power. And I started thinking, if you guys aren't the ones with power, who else would have the power
Right.
other than the American White House, right? The American government. Now you have the power, but nobody ever wants to feel that they have the power, and nobody ever does feel that they have the power. I think this is another effect. You were talking about how complex society is, um, and how hard it is to iron out all these details. I think another effect of the complexity of society is that one person, and in a way this is good, right? It protects us from one crazy person doing a lot of damage. But even one very powerful person, their ability to shape things is very, very limited. Um, and all of their efforts will go through so many other people. Um, and you know, most presidents try to do things and fail, and the world ends up looking pretty much like it was when they were elected, right? Um, so I think that's part of what you see uh, with these resist slogans. You also see this with the protesters a bit, where they say we're fighting against our horrible administration, but then they're also like, why won't our administration like cater our meals or something like that? So people have this very, and again, I don't mean to blame them for it. I think it's very common across the board for there to be this complex relationship of, oh, I'm against the institutions, but also they're on my side. I'm against them, I'm for them. They're on my side, they're against me. In this sort of a bit of both at the same time, and sort of using this, to make oneself feel like a revolutionary, but also make oneself feel like one is being taken care of, right? Um, and so, yeah, I think that you certainly see that dynamic on the left. You probably have similar things on the right. Although, of course, right wing activism takes very different forms. Uh, and in a way is sort of because there's a lot fewer right wingers in academia. There's a little less like theory of right wing activism out
Mm.
there. Um,
Yeah, it's weird, man. People vote against their own interests a lot these days, and I think democracy. Not that we're a republic, so I don't want to get that confused, but we do have some form of representative democracy here, and democracy assumes that people will vote their best interests, and it works or has worked for a long time because generally speaking, when things are less complicated, people have the same base interests. It's just essentially Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, there's obviously some variance there, but just food, water, shelter, and medicine if we can get it, and then some security as well. In Western, I feel like now, just the complexity of things, Western society is like a machine, like an old TI-85 calculator. We've put too much information into it, and now it's fucking crashed, and nobody knows.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how to reboot it, or how to take all the data that we have and put it onto a new operating system that's more, useful for the amount of information we're trying to pour through it. People are confused. I don't know that anybody has any great answers on how to handle this stuff, and it might just be the case that this is an overgrown forest that needs a fire, right? And I don't mean depopulation or anything stupid like that, but it might be it might be time for people to simplify their lives a little bit. I think the problem that a lot of folks, myself included, have with that idea is that, well, I can simplify my life, but these statists and their agents aren't going to stop interfering with my life, right? So no matter what, I can go live somewhere else or do something else, but I'm still going to be paying taxes on property that I already own, so they can spend that money on wars that I don't agree with, right? So I think the problem seems insurmountable to folks in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the complexity of these issues affects a lot of things. One of them is even just the question of, you were talking about voting against your own interests. Even just the question of how to determine your own interests, I think, becomes a lot more difficult. So just for example, I was at a wedding around 10 days ago, and ordering food is really easy at a wedding because it's like you got the beef or the fish or the vegetarian option, right? So you just, you know, it's just really easy to figure out what option you want. Beef is very different from fish, and they're both very different from not having any protein at all, right? Um, but then if you're at some big restaurant and you have a menu with like 30 options, um, it can take a while to figure out which of the options you're interested in, right? Um, and I think often uh, there's one question of do voters do a good job of voting for what they want? There's another question of just how do voters even figure out what they want? Um, Especially you know in a super liberal society where in a sense we don't want to make that many decisions about how other people are going to live. Um, and so we don't want to necessarily say this is what we want our society to look like, this is what we want our culture to look like. Um, I think it can be really hard to even assess what is my interest in this election. Um, and I think that's another reason why people fall back on these heuristics and on this sort of sense of tribalism.
Mm.
So much of it is you know personal or based on like trust, right? How can you trust? And if for this election, I see both sides of it, right? How can you trust Donald Trump, and how can you trust Joe Biden? They don't seem like super. If I came across either of them in the street, I wouldn't necessarily ask them for directions, right? For various reasons, and so I think a lot of people, it ends up being personalized, and it ends up being this very vague sense of, well, I don't know what to do, but I'm, putting it in somebody else's hands, and I need to figure out whether I trust them. And there is, this might not be so new. There's an article. The book is dedicated to a guy who mentored me a little bit when I was starting grad school, Jeffrey Friedman, and he loved this old article by a guy named Philip Converse about whether Americans really have ideologies. And Converse researched it, and his decision was that Americans don't really have ideologies. They sort of have, intuitive preferences for people who they think they can trust, and they'll sort of reason back to their ideologies from what those people say. Um, and I think these days we don't even do it with people so much; we do it with the parties. Um, and it's not clear that if you ask people what sort of world do you want to live in and how does your political party help you achieve that, what policies of theirs are going to help you
Mm.
achieve that. um, People might be able to cite like one core issue that they're really into, um, but it's not clear that most people, even who vote,
Hmm.
are going to have great answers to that sort of question. And that's, you know, voters are not a majority of the American population either, right? So that's the whole question of non-voters is a whole other question about, um, there's a whole slew of Americans who it's really hard to figure out what they even do believe about politics or whether they even really know what's going on in American politics
Sure.
because don't vote, don't answer polls, don't answer surveys, and it could be that maybe they don't trust anybody. Um, or maybe they trust everybody, maybe they think
Mm.
both guys are so great, I can't decide. That's probably not right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think there's a lot of questions about do people have these complex beliefs or are they just sort of putting it in somebody else's hands or do they even have these beliefs at all? And I think for people who think about politics a lot, it can be really tempting to say, well, again, I'm around a lot of Catholics and they'll often use this language of like, politics is about competing visions of what's good, and it's sort of like whose vision is going to win out, whether it's this liberal vision or this, traditionalist vision or something like that. Um, I just think intellectuals have visions of the good and writers have visions of the good. Um, and some sort of like people who, political hobbyists who that's their main, what they do outside of work will have visions of the good. But I think a lot of people are just sort of vibing.
Mm.
Um, and, it can be a little hard to know what to do with that. Um,
Yeah. I think it's. I don't think they know what to do. You mentioned some like the overabundance of choices before. It's paralysis
yeah,
by analysis. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like it's like going to the Cheesecake Factory and looking through their 7,000 page menu. You don't
yeah, exactly.
know where to
Yeah,
even start. On the other point about people, I think people, yeah, are they believe vicariously through some trusted party, probably, right? And usually that trusted party is in no way trustworthy at all, which is kind of interesting. But no successful Fortune 500 company doesn't have a mission statement. I was
yeah,
the VP of marketing at Black Rifle Coffee for a while, and our mission statement was we provide coffee and culture for people who love America. That was that's what So any employee in the company making a decision is the decision I'm making, whether it's choosing some charity to support on the charitable side, or whether it's messaging and marketing. Does all of this support that statement? And I don't know one of the questions I kind of ask, I guess, and not a jest, but kind of tongue in cheek sometimes, because I don't think anybody has an answer to it. Is when you and I were in high school, and somebody said, "What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to you to be an American?" You would have an answer to that question, right? And it may be you may get disparate answers depending on where in the country you were, or the race or class of the person, or something like that. But you would get an answer. I don't know that you would get any answer from
yeah,
kids these days. So they're operating from a point of complete ignorance at this point, because it's not like we have a lot of single issue voters, and I don't think it's reasonable to say, well, what's your vision? Let's say Republicans are in office and you want Democrats to get in. Okay, what are your demands, right? Like, what exactly are you trying to change? Well, I want to live in a world
yeah,
where there's abortion. No, but I mean, that's not a mission statement. That's one
yeah,
issue amongst many, and one that probably won't ever affect your life specifically. So it doesn't make any sense. But that particular issue has dominated for 60 years now.
yeah,
Every election for 60 years, that issue has come up. Not just elections, but confirmation of judges, confirmation of cabinet members, all kinds of crazy shit. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a non sequitur to this process, frankly, right? But it's the dominant issue now, and it just shows how quickly and easily this stuff can be warped, should people not have a very firm grasp on one, as you said, they don't know what they believe, really. I mean, they really don't know what they believe at the core. Because if you do, you can explain why. And we see now, it isn't just, it's easy to dunk on dumb college kids who are just swept up in group psychology, right? It's easy to like ask them, what are your demands? Like, oh, I don't even know. I just showed up to fucking wave a flag around.
yeah,
It's like, all
yeah,
right, cool. That person's easy to fucking dunk on. But what about the 45-year-old person reposting memes on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Do they how deep does their knowledge go? Because I don't think it's that much different.
No, I don't think it's very different at all. And one thing I still notice with myself in my sort of social media, I try to avoid this, but even stuff people write on even stuff that like I write in magazines, I think a lot of the use of political writing and political analysis is just for that sort of like, well, here somebody said I'm right and you're wrong. That's the way it's deployed in conversations between people, and people just sort of throw articles at one another, throw facts at one
Yeah,
another,
yeah, yeah.
without really doing any analysis of those facts. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, the motivation for these things, like you said, a lot of it comes from somebody starting out as being single issue and then just sort of deciding that all these issues go together somehow. Um, which I'm always very skeptical of.
Mm.
And that's another thing I talk about in the book is I don't completely see why. And it sounds like you're on the same page to an extent. I don't completely see why what abortion and immigration and taxes and gun control. It seems like you could analyze all these issues like completely separately. Not to mention foreign policy, right?
Mm.
Although foreign policy in the U.S. at least is more bipartisan than other issues, or less partisan. Um, but yeah, I think it's a very weird political dynamic. And I do think part of it comes from, you were saying these things. It's hard to know how these things affect people's lives, and it's hard to know how the choices people make affect these things. And I think that's part of why people can go a little nuts about things. Um, if you know that you're not going to have an effect, and you also don't, you don't know that it'll trickle down to you, you can make these choices and you can make these slogans. Um, you can say defund the police if it's never going to happen. So you can sort of throw the slogan around. Um, and I do think that that's another effect that the complexity of American politics has, is that um, people can sort of have this radicalism within it because they know that there's not, the consequences of their actions are not clear. The people who say they want to dismantle society, they're never going to be confronted with a dismantled society, because it's just an enormous society that is,
Sure.
their slogan will not dismantle it, right?
Yeah.
So there's something comforting about that. But also, it also makes it hard to figure out what is actually going on.
It sounds like fan behavior, though, right? It's like I'm a fan of a team, and yeah, I'm emotionally invested in the outcome, but it doesn't really affect my life. And
Yeah,
that seems like the lowest common denominator way of deciding how government policies affect other people's lives. I mean, it's to your point, it's radicalism, but they're basically LARPing. You know what I mean? They'll never have
yeah,
to deal with the consequences of their actions. Although some cities have, some cities that chose to defund police, they're living that consequence now.
yeah, yeah. So there were changes. I shouldn't have said, it'll never happen. There were changes in policies, and obviously those have been studied. I think fan behavior is one of the best analogies for it. But even there are beliefs that come up even in the context of sports that are similar to political beliefs. So the best example is, you're watching football with a friend and you're rooting. Each side is rooting for the opposite team. Probably a pass interference call, probably the most obvious, right? Um, it's just almost all the time the two friends will have seen it differently, right? Even at the level of pure perception, it'll look like pass interference to the guy that benefits from the call, and it won't look that way to the guy who doesn't. Not 100% of people. Some people are very fair-minded, and are able to move past this. Um, but I think it's funny that even there are beliefs that arise even in the context of sports, which seems like this pure fandom. Even in the context of pure fandom, we form beliefs about what's going on. and they're subject to sort of irrationality like this. Um, and certainly there are things like, you know, there are things like sports calls in politics. And there's, again, with the protests, there's been a lot of questions about are people taking dives, this sort
Mm,
of, this soccer phraseology. First of all, maybe some Jewish students and Jewish commentators are sort of going looking for instances of anti-Semitism at the protests. Um, and then on the other hand, some protesters on some videos, a police officer will touch them gently and they'll fall to the ground, right? Um, and so yeah, you have these, and you see, and people watch these videos and see very, very different things. Um, and So yeah, I think there are really close analogies, but I don't think that the fact that it's fan behavior takes it completely outside of the realm of rationality and irrationality, because there are still these there are these one thing I'm super interested in is these flashpoint events that, you know, rationally they could go either way, but they serve as these sort of staging grounds for political disputes. So things like, I mean, instances of police violence are excellent examples. So the hands up, don't shoot
hmm.
from what was it? Michael Brown and
Yep.
Ferguson.
Yep.
Um, this was only one instance of police violence. So statistically, it really doesn't make or break the question of how black people are treated by police, which should be, is, and Roland Fryer, was an economist who took one view. Obviously, liberal commentators take another view. Um, but one instance shouldn't necessarily determine how we think about this, but people sort of, get obsessed with the one instance, and it becomes really important that it goes one way or the other. Um, and and yeah, these individual instances of these like flashpoint events, we get really involved with them in our political beliefs, and I think they're another example of, people will spend hours researching, all the ins and outs of one of these very specific situations, and it's not as though, one your policies should not emerge from one of these flashpoints, right? They should emerge from a sort of holistic view of what happens across a wide range of cases.
Yeah,
Um,
and if you think about that, so take that from the macro level and bring it down to the micro level. We're talking about like riot psychology, right? I don't know if you've ever looked into this stuff before, but
Not too much.
like the way that in a tense situation, one little spark can set everything off. In just in a group of like 10 or more people is really bizarre the way it works. And now you map that on to this much larger group of people who again have readjusted their view on society to the oppressor oppressed dynamic. So it seems like these days we jump from one event to another without any gap in between them. Sometimes they overlap for some amount of time. I think that's probably why it is. I think people are just stuck in this mentality, and any little spark is going to set them off, right? And it,
Yeah.
it certainly doesn't help that there are outside instigators who are funding all this shit either. But to be honest, even without the funding, I'm not sure it wouldn't exist, at least to some level. Maybe not to the broader level, because these people who are professional activists can't afford to do any of this stuff on their own, certainly.
Yeah.
But they would just stay more where they are locally and try to instigate that way, I think.
I mean, yeah, certainly one thing about yeah, I haven't read too much about riot psychology, but just in like from introspecting about my own psychology, um, often we have there's a story that, things happen and then we have emotions about them that are reactions to those situations, right? But I feel that just as often we sort of have emotions that we can't justify, and then we go looking for situations that will feel appropriate for them, because we want to be able to express those emotions in a way that feels appropriate, right? Um, so people who sort of, a lot of people in politics feel that the world is unfair, or that others are out to get them, or maybe they feel very angry or very sad. Um, and I think that they will search out, and then I think this is true of myself as well. It's not a criticism of anybody again. Um, and they'll sort of search out a circumstance that enables them to express their emotions, politically, and to feel as though those emotions are appropriate. Um, and they might be right that there's emotion. Right, again, like, the Middle East, this is a war in which a lot of people are dying, and that is always tragic, and it is always completely sensible to be sad about that, and to want it to stop. Um, but I do think that the psychology of getting involved in politics often does have to do with, people who start with the feeling and are looking for the reason for it,
Mm,
rather than, people who are reacting to events,
sure.
to begin with. So it's a sort of motivated reasoning, or a kind of circular reasoning involving emotions.
Sure. And that seems like a function of a fragile, damaged, or broken epistemology to me, right? Because if there's a well to go to for that information, people go to it and instinctually. There will be certainly contrarians and dissenters who won't participate in that process, but by and large, the broader population looks at them and is like, "Oh, well, you're just stupid, right?
Yeah.
We have the data right here." Now it seems in the absence of that, we've moralized or even made noble the idea of the lived experience, as a point of reference. Like, I mean, come on, man. Like, look, I'm interested in what happens to you specifically to some degree, but I'm not going to build my worldview on that. And if
Yeah.
you're building your entire worldview on just what happens to you, you're a fucking idiot. Frankly, like your life is going to suck all the
Yeah.
time. It'll always suck. So one of the questions before we get out of here, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you talk
Mhm.
about epistemology in the book a lot, is what processes do we need to go through to rebuild this stuff, or is it even possible at
Yeah.
this point?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the big gap in the book is that I never felt like I came up with a completely satisfying answer to what we really ought to be doing. One thing I say near the end is, maybe we ought to, part of it is, I think we ought to pull back from politics to a certain extent. Not that I have, um, but as a source of meaning, uh, I don't think it. I think it's a sort of false replacement for other belief systems,
Mm,
and doesn't actually provide the source of meaning that religion could. Again, like you said, not that we should return to religion. If people believe, then they should believe. But I don't think you can make yourself religious if you're not. Um, but yeah, I think one takeaway for me was, it's difficult for politics to serve this role in grounding people's identities and grounding people's sense of meaning, that maybe it's taken on this function that it's taken on in
mm.
society.
And
Um,
if it's doing that, how do we not just create another caste system? To be honest, right?
yeah, no, I think that's a real danger as well. That's why, one of the chapters I was most careful in was the chapter on experts.
Mm,
And I have a lot of fear of the expert caste. Um, Maybe I'm, now that I have a doctorate, maybe I'm a sort of traitor to my class in that way. Um, but I have a lot of fear of the experts, and of people who take on the title expert, sort of, intentionally, knowingly. So that's another kind of takeaway, is to, don't be so trusting. You have to ask where other people got their beliefs from before you trust them. Uh, I would say that, I think one of the broad takeaways, so there's a connection. The book is about a whole bunch of different things, but one connection is that politics has to do with feeling like we're a member of a group. And one way that manifests in contemporary American politics is, like we talked about, having these clusters of beliefs that all seem to go together. But then if you look at them closely, you just sort of realize, well, this is just like what some people put on a party platform 20 years ago that is now sort of calcified into what's called an ideology, but doesn't really have the features of an ideology, isn't really coherent, isn't really sensible. Um, and so I do think that, one thing people can do is just be a little more critical about, how do my beliefs go together, or do my beliefs really go together? Um, and I think in dealing with people we disagree with, one of the things I think, and maybe I don't talk about this so much in the book, but I think one of the things we can do is just always press people for reasons. And there's two things that can happen when you press people for reasons for what they do. It's very easy to just say, well, I know that belief. It's crazy. I've already ruled that out. When you press people for reasons, there's two things that can happen. One is that the person you're talking to can realize that they don't have reasons for what they believe, and then maybe they'll think about changing their mind. But the other thing is that maybe they do have reasons for what they believe, and instead of just, doing what they say, you can take their reasons without taking their belief, right? And you can sort of integrate the good in their perspective into yours without the bad. So if take immigration, you know, if somebody's an open borders person and then they talk to somebody who says, well, immigration is destroying union jobs. Well, then, you don't have to be anti-immigration, but then maybe you can think about, what do we do for people who are losing their union jobs, right? So you don't have to change your opinion, but you can build out your understanding of the situation in a more nuanced way. And one thing I've always noticed in the discourse, and I do think this is something that I do well at, a lot of people, instead of doing something like this, when there's an opposing view or an opposing argument, they sort of won't even address the opposing argument. They don't even address the other side's reasons, even to say that they're bad reasons. They'll just sort of try to attack the other people. So I think always looking at what reasons people actually provide on the other side is a good first step. Even though that can, in a way, if they're bad reasons, that can make you more sort of radical in your opposition to them. If you think they only have bad reasons for their views.
Yeah, I mean, one of the pieces of advice that I usually give people when they're asking me about political discourse is just because you disagree with someone's conclusion doesn't mean there isn't a problem there to be solved, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly right.
and you can't, how do you figure it out unless you talk through it? And how do you talk through it unless you have a good foundation, not just of the facts surrounding that case, but of how political beliefs work from a philosophical perspective, right? Like how do you get from 0 to 10 or whatever, however you want to call it, from tabula rasa to a legit formed opinion, is really important to understand that pathway. So, go buy the book. It's Political Beliefs: A Philosophical Introduction. I think it's on pre-order now, and they start shipping in the middle of the month, right? May 14th or 15th, something like that.
And there's also a PDF available online as well.
Great. So yeah, go buy the book. I think it's a really good primer for this sort of stuff. To maybe you'll read it and see, oh, the way that I came to this particular conclusion doesn't make a lot of sense. And you know what? You may go through the processes and arrive at the exact same conclusion again, but at least now you know. And then when you get into that conversation, instead of just shouting talking points at each other, you can actually have a conversation, which I think is very valuable for all of us. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate your time. Tell everybody where they can find you online if you're publishing stuff in addition to the book.
Oh yeah, well you can find me on Twitter at Oliver Traldi, OliverTraldi. Not at my best in terms of reasonable discourse, but like you said, maybe I'm funny sometimes.
Yeah.
And usually, if I write something, I'll tweet it there. You can find the link to my book there. Yeah, that's my main platform. So
Perfect. Well, thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it.
yeah, it was great talking to you.
You as well, and thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.